what was the feedback and what was the course of action?
Uh, my my current role, I'm the head of account open platform for online medium, where I allow the account opens. My team takes care of account opening for business and individual customers. So, given that one of the feedbacks, this is a scenario where when we were trying to open the accounts for business banking accounts, number one bank in the entire world, entire nation to allow real-time account opening. So given that,
Before we get too far into this interview, a couple of things I'd like to highlight here. One, this is an engineering manager, and this is actually a pretty senior engineering leader who is targeting a role at Amazon, but kind of tech more broadly, but specifically this engineering manager was targeting making a transition from a smaller company to a company the size of Amazon. The question that was being asked of this engineering manager was targeted in customer obsession. If you got that, awesome, great. You're very good at matching questions to leadership principles. If not, I do have a free tool available at guessthelp.com. Here's a couple things I want you to look out for as you watch this interview of a more senior leader, a more seasoned leader, someone with more experience, things that they do in an interview that a lot of people don't do, and you tend to do when you're a more senior person, is finding ways to layer in other competencies, other leadership principles within the context of an answer meant to address a different leadership principle, but bringing in elements of the story that help highlight you as a more well-rounded leader. Second, in the context of this being a relatively senior leader, look for places in the story where this candidate basically had pretty big misses as far as you're a leader, how did that happen? And finally, I see this a lot in interviews where candidates get a bit confused as to what is the most important thing to cover, which is why I really focus in really hard on the STAR FAC model for how you should approach your story development. Is this candidate getting lost in the weeds in the background material that they're providing?
one of the challenges that we were at the top of on cloud nine, saying that, oh, we were the first ones to open the account. We were the first ones to open the account. And when we went in and we were celebrating the success, one of the things that happened was, as part of that, I went and visited the branch where for one of the celebrations, and one of the banker came back to me and said, like, "Hey, it's great we are celebrating this, but I had too many customers come back to me and say like their accounts were closed after they were opened online." So that was a concerning thing to me. And we
Like
went back.
closed as in the account's auto closed?
We have a day two review process that happens after an account is open. Opening a business account is a very challenging aspect, Brandon. The reason is, if you're opening an individual, it's simple. You give like four fields: name, address, SSN, date of birth. We verify who you are by going to the bureaus. But for a business, we don't have a single bureau where we can go get them. And we have to verify the business, we have to verify the individual that's related to the business, and we have to verify all the partners on the business, make sure they're all good before we open an account for a business. So given this background, we open the account, and then we also do like a OFAC screening, D2 screening, and there are like many regulations that happen post account open. So when we were doing this review, when we were opening the accounts, one of the things was we opened the account by going to some of the bureaus and validating the data. But where after I got the comment, I looked back and we saw like 20% of the accounts that we opened are getting closed. And this is where I dig deeper into seeing why was this 20% of the accounts getting closed. They were getting closed by one of the operations team in San Antonio, Texas, where they are. So I visited San Antonio, Texas to sit with them saying that, hey, what are the things that you are actually closing? So when they came up, and I came up with this 19-point checklist that said they are checking for these 19-point checklists. And when they were checking for these 19-point checklists, one of their biggest challenge was they were trying to, after we opened the account, they were trying to reach back to the customer to say, can you provide me these additional information? And it wasn't clear for the business owner, because most of the business owners, they are new to business. I open a business account the moment I open a new business. If I already have an existing 10-year business, then the likelihood of me coming and opening a business is very low. So for those people, for those new business owners, it was becoming difficult to understand the business terminology that they needed to give. So when this came up, one of the things that we did was like we understood the 19-point checklist, and uh, based on that, I changed the account open process wherein with these 19-point checklists, we were able to go to the vendors, and of those 19 points, 17 of those we were able to go get from vendors. So we took the consent from the customer, we took 17 of those coming back from the vendors, and we auto-populated it for the ops team to
Wait,
go and
tell
solve.
me, hold on. So there are 19 items and 17 of them you could get from someone else?
We were able to get from the bureaus, like
Okay.
credit bureau,
Yep. Yep.
LexisNexis. We were able to go to like Secretary of State, and so these were other bureaus from where we could get those feeds, like the data formation and those, and there were some articles that we needed to get. All of these we were able to capture from the vendors. So we changed our initial step was stand up and open the account. Then, based on the feedback I got, we went and improved our process. And that's one of the reasons why you could see we increased the funnel rate and account closure rates in my current opening process. I'll stop there and see if you have any.
There's a lot of content ground to cover with this first part of this candidate's answer. One, it was a lot of preamble to essentially explain. We heard from our branch managers that they had a high number of customers escalating because their accounts were being prematurely closed for unknown reasons. Okay. So I say it again and again and again, when you are interviewing, it doesn't matter what level you are, but as you get more senior, right, there's just, you should know for better communication techniques. I, as the interviewer, don't need to be an expert at your job to do your job. Certainly, I've seen a lot of content out there that says your answers need to be 1 minute long, which if there was a rage button I could hit. There is no time limit on your answer. Your answer should be as long as it needs to be and not one word longer. But in this case, what the candidate didn't do was directly address the question as asked. Who was the customer? In this case, he actually had two customers, branch managers and the end customers. The end customers were complaining to the branch manager were complaining to him. Who was his customer here? He didn't really clearly identify that or who he was serving. It's a little bit unclear. Two, what was their problem? That he clearly identified. Three, what was the difficult feedback? Well, was it difficult feedback that they're auto closing accounts, that their customer service was bad, that they didn't really understand what's going on? Like, what was the actual difficult feedback that they were receiving inbound versus kind of seeing bad numbers, which is what tipped him off to this? And then finally, how did it surface to the team? Well, he went out and he was touring the branches and he was getting feedback from the branch manager. So that's actually good customer obsession. It's really good. But there was a lot of preamble here that maybe gets a little bit lost what the point of what he's trying to say. It makes it a little bit harder to evaluate the answer. Now, give him a little bit of a rope. This was the very first question in our interview, in the mock interview, but it is definitely overloading me, the interviewer, with additional kind of context and information. And what I ultimately don't understand, which kind of feels like core to the problem, is there was 19 pieces of data that they could get from their customers that they needed to keep the accounts open, 17 of which they could automate from getting from other sources. As someone who, I have a business account, I don't remember it being this difficult to open a business account. So he hasn't explained that problem to me. And therein lies the challenge. I'm the interviewer. I'm sitting on this side of the desk and I'm listening to what you have to say to me. That's all I have to go on is what you are saying to me. And if you don't clearly outline that problem, I start filling in the blanks with my lived experience, which is actually not great for you. Because if I fill it in wrong or just think, well, what's going on there? That doesn't make a lot of sense. If I can't leave the room and advocate for you because I clearly understand everything that you said to me and then can tell the other folks in the hiring loop, this person's awesome and here's why, that's your failure as the candidate. And so in this case, I don't fully understand what those 19 fields are, what 17 they can automate. How did they discover that? How did they get to that point? Are they important? Are they not? That's important in this part of the setup. And he didn't spend the time on that. he kind of rambled on some other things. So this is clearly certainly a very thoughtful, high level manager, but in terms of storytelling and assisting me, the interviewer, it's a little bit of a struggle. Let's see what happens. So the first one is, so you were, the claim was that you were number one for opening business accounts.
Yes.
And I don't understand upon what metric you're taking credit. Is it that you were just like sheer number of accounts that you guys were opening, or versus the industry? Or can you just tell me more about how you were ranking yourselves? Just as a side point here, this is me, the interviewer, having something of a minor brain fart in the middle of the interview, right? I was trying so hard, struggling to process everything that he had said, that I got hung up on a totally inconsequential point. While I have done many hundreds of these now, specifically for you, the customer, but thousands in my lifetime, sometimes I will make mistakes, and I'm here to admit to you so you can see the signs of when an interviewer is struggling to keep up with what you said and is trying to make sense of everything and is basically buying themselves time. This was me buying myself time. So if you get asked a weird question like this, where you're like, well, that's a weird question. At least in my case, data point of one, this was me trying to buy time because I was struggling to piece together the narrative and then figure out what good follow-on question I can ask. So this was a stalling tactic on my part.
Let me tell you how we were number one, right? Up until like 2017, not even a single major bank allowed real-time account open online because of the complexity of the account open process that I described. So every time, if you go online for business banking, try to open a business banking account, they collect your information and then get back to them like at least like 4 or 5 different tries. Like you go to Wells Fargo right now, they don't have a real-time account open even today. Was the first bank to allow business banking accounts open in real time. So I could go and open an account for business and I'll get my own account, my debit card and everything on the moment I click the submit button, if I'm qualified for that. So that was the first thing that we did. So Chase was number one in opening account, not in number of accounts, but in opening accounts. In real time.
And so it seems to me, if the metric you were using was account opens, but you found out anecdotally about account closures, what I'm hearing is you had no process in place to actually audit to ensure the take rate. And I'm not sure if that's the right frame, but the success rate of the account opens. Is that correct? And here's where my brain actually caught up to what I wanted to get at in the interview. Okay. The customer has outlined a problem that they had. And unfortunately, he framed it using metrics which clearly didn't matter in the context of what problems they had within their business. They relied on a vanity metric, account opens, but didn't have the backend infrastructure to actually make sure that the usage rate was there. So cool, you got a bunch of account opens, but if you close a bunch of them automatically, by the way, which is terrible, you're kind of relying on this one metric, awesome, but you have no real customer sat metric coming out the other side. You have no user data that's telling you that what you've done is working and is long-term effective and that those customers are valuable. So that is what this specific question is getting at, which is, okay, I've now caught up and I understand what you're saying by number one, cool, but here's the problem. You were focusing on account opens. What about use rates? How are you auditing this?
So, right. The current metrics that we have, we're trying to open the account and we check the deposits in the account, right? And the account closures were coming up because of the D2 review process. They close in like 30 days. So the current metrics that we have check for account opens like within like first 2 weeks. So they check the account and they check whether they have deposited the amount of funding or not. So if they did not deposit any funds, then we auto close the account in like 2 weeks. So we were having our process in those metrics where within first 15 days, how we were closing the accounts. But we didn't have it with the day 2 review process that actually said, oh, we reach back to the customer for additional information. So that had an SLA of 30 days. So that was a process that
Hold
was
on.
not.
And so explain that to me better, because the day two review would reveal that, okay, we reached out to a customer and you would wait until you heard back from the customer. And if you didn't hear back from the customer within 30 days, you close the account.
We close the account.
Got it.
And we send the check and everything back, right? So there are two ways of closing an account. Right? The first way is if they open the account but they did not fund the account, then we close the account in like 15 days. The second way is we open the account and we do our monthly review saying that, hey, is the information that they provided right? Or do they have their NAICS code? Like a NAICS code is how we match a business to an individual customer, right? To a business, to a government defined, like there are like 2000 NAICS codes out there. So government defined categorization of the business. We look at that business and then we check that they properly categorized. So there are like these whole bunch of things that we go through. And that review process happens like 30 days after, at least like 30 days.
I got it. Okay, so this is a case where I want to address a common question I get, which is when talking about what you've done in your previous work, do you use the word I or we? And it really depends on a lot of things, right? Most companies want to know what you do, how you work, why, what you did, why you did those things, et cetera. And I works in that case. But also when you're managing teams and you're working with other people, you don't want to be the person who tries to take credit for everything. But in this specific case, there was a set of processes that had kind of overlapping dependencies, which one obviated the other, right? They were closing before they actually got to the end of the next kind of gate point on a potential closure rate if they didn't get checks deposited, but the checks deposited didn't happen because they didn't reach the customer, right? So there's kind of this overlapping set of circumstances where they weren't getting to the second checkpoint. And this is a fundamental breakdown in the design of the system. And based on what this candidate said, he was responsible for the design of the system. And so he keeps saying we, where he's talking about the bank that he worked at least that's how it comes across. What he's not saying is, my design didn't account for this. What my team had built did not account for this. What my team had built did not address this. And this is a case where I, as an interviewer, I'm looking for the candidate to show just a bit more ownership in terms of addressing this gap in what is clearly a problem in terms of how the kind of steps were laid out and where the long pole was in terms of what was causing an auto closure versus not. And so how did you prioritize this feedback against everything else that you had?
So when we were great question, right? So when we were planning for the initial one, we did have, because we were the first one, we were opening the account for the first time. So I did have like 20% of my capacity for the learnings that we were trying to do from the business once we opened the business account. And then we have our backlog priority where we wanted to do the enhancements. So when we know, I use that 20% capacity to have this impact, because this is like, if we are shutting down the accounts in like 30 days, right? It's not a good experience for the customer, because for the customer, account open is the first platform that they come into a bank. That's their opening gate into an entry gate into a bank. And if that is not a welcoming experience, then they would never come back. That was the reason why this was given like a very high priority for the deliverables that we wanted to have.
It's interesting. The note that I made, I take very copious notes when I do these mock interviews with candidates, was interviewers not sure they heard or processed this answer block correctly. That's a note that I would send to the candidate so they can see all the notes that I've taken. And having now re-listened to it, I don't know what the question was. How do you prioritize the work? He didn't tell me that. So now I'm listening to an engineering manager who is not walking me through how he prioritizes work. He talked about 20% slack time, right? And he's talking about the importance of the first customer interaction. All of that is true. But the question was, how are you prioritizing this work? And it seems to me, listening to this, and I've never worked in banking, so I'm someone who's led engineering teams, who's led product teams, I've had multi-billion-dollar revenue responsibility. What I'm hearing is, we had a completely broken new user sign-up flow, and we were measuring the wrong things, and that came to light because we were out talking to our kind of mid-tier intermediary customer, who was the branch managers, who were letting us know the problems with the system. and we were causing a lot of customer dissat. That feels to me like a stop everything you're doing and fix this. Not a, well, we had 20% slack time and yeah, it was important. But there was the sense of urgency wasn't there. And that's something that you can absolutely control within the context of your answers when you're talking in an interview, is conveying the urgency that you felt when a particular problem presented itself to you as a leader.
I guess I can see how conflicting review cycles overlapped here, and that's how it got missed. I get that. But the fact that there were 17 of 19 items that you could go automate and get and pull in, how come that wasn't part of the initial plan? It just seems like a lot. It'd be one thing if it was like 4 or 5, but 17 is a lot, right? So why wasn't that part of the initial plan?
Valid question, right? These 17 were not during the initial plan, because when we were opening the account at the time, we were validating what the customer inputted to us. And these 17 were part of the day 2 review, which was not yet incorporated into the account open process. So there was a gap in the analysis of, because initially we were trying to stand up and then see, but there was also a gap in the analysis of why did we miss those 17? So after an account is open, what happens within account? There are servicing pieces. There are like other screenings that we needed to also review. So there was a gap in this, which led to us discovering what happened.
But I'm still not clear as to how, like, I get it if it was like the team, I don't know the name of the team, but the team in San Antonio said, well, these are the 19 things we're looking at. But were those 19 things not part of the initial scoping? And you were unaware of them? I'm confused about that part.
But they were not part of the initial scoping, right? Okay. These operations that we were closing in, right? So that's what I was trying to say. Let me make it clear. So we opened the account and we were auto closing if they were not funding, and then that was done.
Mm-hmm.
But
where'd you go?
And that was done by this operations team, which was not involved in the initial account open process, because they actually go and review all the accounts that were open in the branch and they were open in the online medium. So because of that, they were not initially part of the account open process that we were trying to do.
Got it. Right?
So that was one of the reasons why we identified, oh, there is a gap here that we could make things better. And in this 17, one of the things was also like this team was not, they were trying to collect like the driver's license of the individual that was trying to open the account. And we were validate, and that is a valid requirement if I go to a branch. But online, we go to credit bureau and validate that the customer is validated based on their information. But that information did not get passed to this particular team. So that was these were some of the examples why we had those gaps and how so that was where I went and visited these were identified when I visited the Texas, Austin location. And I sat with them, understood what their concerns were. So I did a deep dive into what were those different concerns. And we took into each of them and addressed like, this is how this is validated. So we had to explain. It was more of a discovery/learning process that we went.
This is absolutely a case where learning how to communicate your stories and doing so effectively can mean the difference between a good interview, a bad interview, or a good interview and a great interview. In this specific instance, this is a very senior leader who clearly has a lot of experience and was working on a very big, thorny problem of sufficient scope, pretty big scope, right? Handling all new business customer signups and account openings for a bank, a major bank at that. That's a lot of scope. I still don't understand, based on the answer that was given to me, based on the information, that's all I have to go on is what, as the interviewer, that's all I have is what you give me, the candidate. What was the fault of this engineering manager? How was he utilizing his resources to address this problem? Why were these misses in place really? Like, what was part of the process that was overlooked? Was that a bank issue, or was that just the way he was managing his team issue? That didn't really come through loud and clear. What were the results, right? I don't understand, again, based on what was said in the interview, the percent of accounts that came back closed early and leading to poor dissat with customers before and after. What did that look like? What was the time frame in which it took him to get this done? How did that compare to how much time they allocated? What was the feedback from the branch managers? There's a lot of FAQ type questions that I would ask of this candidate that, just in the context of the interview, we're trying to cover a lot of time. I didn't. And unfortunately, it's going to cost, it will cost you as a candidate. Because if you're not filling in all of those, like the questions that matter, and you're kind of rambling a little bit and you're not telling your story very well, one, I'm going to tune out a little bit. So this is where the 1 minute rule of your answer, it doesn't really apply. But if you do talk too long and you ramble, yeah, I'm going to tune out. That is real. But you prevent yourself from rambling by having a clear kind of story structure as to how you're telling your story. And part of that is tied to making sure you understand the questions that are important. And in this case, the results just weren't clear. We fixed it. Okay, but what does that mean? I still don't know. How long did it take? How many resources? What was the time? None of that came through. So that for you as the interview candidate, storytelling is your greatest ally. Your ability to clearly communicate, your greatest ally. Because you can take someone who's clearly experienced, clearly worked on a massively scoped thing at a very large bank, clearly an important role. And the way the story ultimately landed was just okay. I wasn't super excited. There were too many unanswered questions, which, in an interview, you just run out of time. And then when I have to go to the assessment meeting, am I going to stand up and advocate for this person? Maybe. Depends on how the rest of the interview goes. Maybe. But it wasn't a resounding yes after this one answer block. And this was the first question in the interview. I get it. But it, the candidate was a little nervous. That always happens. But it's just something to keep in mind when you think about ways in which you can overperform in your interview to impress folks like myself. As always with these interviews, when I play them back, I like to now cover out on the assessment I would have read into the room for this candidate had I been on the loop if they were hiring him or interviewing at my company. Customer obsession. There was definitely plenty to like from the candidate regarding customer obsession. The candidate also demonstrated bias for action and quickly recognizing the issue, taking action to get from customer branch manager conversations to the operations center personnel who were executing the account cleanup. What is missing from this answer and is an area of concern for customer obsession is clarity around how the operations center requirements were missed. This was clearly a complicated process, but for the level of the candidate, this feels like an unnecessary miss. So when I highlighted the things to look out for, right, adding in the additional elements, bias for action, some missing ownership. Like there's ways in which when you tell your story, you don't have to just stick to the leadership principle that it is, right? When you get asked a question that's kind of rooted in a competency, you can pull in other elements. That's a win. But when there's a big miss, that can be problematic, especially when that big miss is directly rooted to the point of the question. And in this situation, I've already covered plenty of ground. It's just the candidate didn't do a great job of clearly outlining the problem and how they addressed it and what, just kind of how they dealt with the miss and what that looked like on the fix. And then finally, one of the things I said look out for was, are they getting lost in background material? And clearly that has come through loud and clear, right? The candidate spent a lot of time, in some cases, just talking about things which weren't really clearly communicating what I, the interviewer, need to understand about him, the candidate, in terms of how they work, what they did, and why they did it, right? So just something to think about as you watch these videos. This is a much more senior candidate than my normal videos. They tend to be mid-managers. This is a much more senior person, a little further along in their career. So it's a good opportunity to get a lens into, just because you have more complex stories to tell, doesn't necessarily mean you're a great storyteller. And that's something we can all work on.